Our lecture today is entitled The Role of the Spiritual Teacher. The reason it is so important is that most people recognize a significant need to be taught, to have basic instruction in the laws of God. And because they recognize this, they reach out to contact some individual that they feel can help them to understand more about themselves and more about the mysteries of the universe. We all will allow that there are many mysteries in the universe, that these mysteries invite and welcome the penetration of the knowledge of the universe by the intelligence of man. But from whence comes this intelligence which is in man, if not from God to begin with? It is a probing of God by God, which is a strange thing in a way, because already we can conceive of the fact that we have a gnosis, which means a totality of knowledge, even hidden knowledge of the whole universe within ourselves. The problem then seems to be, can we actually come to bring this hidden knowledge that is within ourselves out from the depth of ourselves and into a relevancy to life itself? Can we relate it, cause and effect-wise, to life? This is a question which we all probably have within ourselves. How do we relate? How do we as individuals relate to the universe and to our fellow men? So the role of the spiritual teacher becomes very important, because in the old writings we read, when man is ready, then the spiritual teacher will appear. Now, it is almost ludicrous, and yet it is very sad, that there are many pseudo-religious and spiritual teachers that do the appearing all right, all over the face of the planet, and succeed in confusing any number of people on many, many issues, so that the last state of the person, for all of the instruction that they receive, is even worse than it was when they started. So the first thing that we should understand is that we should seek to please God ourselves and ask God to bring us a spiritual teacher who will really have the contact, the connection with God, and we ourselves should seek also to have a connection with God. Unless this happens, unless we have a longing in ourselves to be connected with God, we cannot actually magnetize a true spiritual teacher. But we will, because of our own inadequacy, many times draw ourselves to someone who is not a true spiritual teacher. This is so easily done. And I remember one time years ago, during the time of World War II, when I was serving under Captain Hancock, that one evening late I came into the orderly room, and he called me by name, and he said, "You know," we were talking, by the way, about human problems. He said, "Do you know," he said, "Mark," he said, "the borderline between sanity and insanity is very, very narrow. It is almost a razor's edge." And I think that we can apply this also to spiritual knowledge by saying that the borderline between true spiritual knowledge and false spiritual knowledge is very, very narrow, because the false teachers actually draw many great truths from the Bible and from the hidden writings of the world, and are usually people who are themselves very deceived and mixed up. So because they are mixed up, they find it very easy to muddle everyone else, you see. And they're not even, in many, many cases, aware of the fact that they are muddling the minds of all kinds of people. I probably could draw a lot of illustrations, but I might get detoured from my central theme here, which is the role of the spiritual teacher. And now we have to have an assumption. We have to assume that we are dealing with a real spiritual teacher and forget the pseudo-spiritual teacher who doesn't know which way is up and which way is down. In fact, to a lot of these people, the whole thing is based on name and fame or personal pride and the desire to find an easy living for themselves. But we have devoted our life to God purely to seek the kingdom of heaven first and His righteousness, and then we trust that all these things will be added unto us if we need it. Our needs actually are not too many, because our needs are mainly spiritual objectives and the service of the masters. But in the case of many people today, we learn that what is really behind their functioning as a spiritual teacher is a hidden motivation, which I want to bring into the open. There is a great deal of inferiority complexes among the people of the whole world. That's one of the first things a good salesman learns. He learns that he has to deal with the human ego at his own level. And the level of the human ego is very deceptive. People often buy from someone who flatters them, or someone that they like, because they choose to think that all this flattery is genuine. And after all, they have such a high opinion of themselves that when the salesman tells them how wonderful, quote, they are, they decide that right then and there this man really is on the beam, and they're going to patronize him because the sweetest music to their ears is to hear their own praises sung. Now I have to tell you this because it will set the stage. It will set the stage for what will follow. People then have inferiority complexes. They feel very, very ordinary, very common, very inadequate to meet the needs of the world. Actually, they think themselves to be nothing. And so, in order to turn from this undesirable condition to become something, they decide that they have to be recognized by the world. So their reason or their motive for becoming a spiritual teacher is so they can have a group of little sycophants or people around them that will bask in the glow of their supposed flame. So the greatest dream that they have is that they can become a guru. They never start with the right premise. They never start with the right premise, which is, God is the guru. I want to sit at His feet. Let Him take me where He wants to take me. He can bring me and direct me to the right spiritual teacher. But I will first not try to be a spiritual teacher. I will first try to be spiritually taught and correctly taught. When the correct teaching is considered as all important, rather than the having of some spiritual teacher, where his name or fame can lend glamour to our own. Someone can say, as in the case of St. Paul, who was a good man, he said, I am a Hebrew of the Hebrews, and he said, I was taught at the feet of Gamaliel. Now Gamaliel, of course, was a great scholar, recognized by the world back in those days. So all of us should pause to understand that name and fame, popularity, are often a consideration. You all probably have heard of Sri Aurobindo. Well, of course, to be able to say, I sat at the feet of Aurobindo, or I sat at the feet even of Mahatma Gandhi, or someone, this brings a certain glamour even to the disciple, because the disciple who does not feel adequate himself feels that the spiritual teacher is adequate, and therefore they follow him more for the name and fame, more for the actual monetary considerations, because the organization may or may not be affluent, but at least it's popular, than they actually do for the spiritual teachings. So in bringing out the proper setting for this lecture today, I want you all to understand that the first consideration should be the teachings and never the teacher. The teachings themselves are meant to accomplish a certain function which is as simple as an elevator. Years ago, they used to have an elevator that went down while the other car would be going up. They had two elevators. One would go up and the other would go down. And then this one would go down and the other one would go up. A very simple mechanism with weights and counterbalances. We find such an example in the case of John the Baptist. John the Baptist made a statement. He said of Christ, he said, "He must increase, but I must decrease." He recognized his own role, the role of John the Baptist, as one which would become continually a decreasing role, whereas the role of the Christ would become increasing. So, the one thing that everyone has to learn to do is to have genuine humility. Unless we have genuine humility, we will not go far on the path. And we should think in terms of objectives rather than in terms of egos. Why should we turn around and be enmeshed or caught or trapped in the human ego that someone says, "I am a great master," or "this person is a great master," when God is the master and the one guru that can teach us correctly? I am not, by the way, belittling gurus, nor am I belittling spiritual teachers. I'm simply trying to set into perspective for you all some of the considerations that are very prevalent throughout the world. All over the world where you travel, you will find then false teachers as well as true teachers. But many and most of the false teachers are primarily ego-oriented people. But they have learned the jargon. The jargon means the language of the spiritual disciple. They can talk about egos, they can talk about the Holy Christ self, they can talk about the higher mental body, they can talk about the rings around the presence. They know all the language without actually having the experience. And the thing that is important to every one of you is the genuine experiences with God that you will have in your own life that may be the result of the teachings of your spiritual teacher, if he be correctly oriented, or may be the result of your own sincerity. But you have to have these experiences for yourself, and you cannot bask in the glow of someone else's fire. You have to understand that you have a fire inside of yourself, and that that fire is just as good as anyone else's fire on the planet. Even the great masters, men like Master Moria, will tell you again and again that your salvation will not occur, quote, because of my fire, but because of your fire. So you see, we have to direct the consciousness backward to recognize that the individual is all important, not as an ego, but as one to whom is given great spiritual endowments, who must now recognize that although he may be a diamond in the rough, he is able, by the correct spiritual understanding, to polish that diamond in the rough until he literally glows with light. And this is the important phase of everyone's experience, will be that they experience for themselves the way of opening the door of their own consciousness. Now, I'm going to, of course, cover the role of the spiritual teacher. Don't worry about that, dear hearts. But I am first of all going to bring in these necessary preparatory remarks because they are all important. You have to understand that the genuine spiritual teacher does nothing with his disciple except whatever he does is calculated to evoke the right God response in the disciple. Every consideration is for the disciple, not for the teacher. And when you start in basking in the glow of someone else and you say, "Oh, great teacher, please help me." Well, of course, this is a different situation. You're saying, "Please help me," to the great teacher. You're acting as though the teacher could himself confer upon you everything. The teacher can only help you to awaken in yourself the sleeping giant of your own spirituality. And if you have debris around that spirituality, if you have a focus of negative spirals around yourself, the sooner you clean up the negative spirals, the quicker the spiritual teacher can actually fulfill his role, which is to act as the way shower. Let me ask you a question. You surely know that of the 12 disciples that Jesus had, many of them did not ascend at the close of his embodiment as he did. Obviously then, the spiritual teacher was more advanced than were the disciples. But in later years, throughout the historical stream and even in the present era, we have found that some of these disciples were still here on the earth plane as long as just a few short years ago, and have made their ascension and have gone on at last after 2,000 years. In fact, the Apostle James was Louise Kinninger. Louise Kinninger was the mother of the Flame, and a very lovely person, and who was very devoted to Jesus. And at the close of her embodiment, she was promised by Mother Mary that she would make her ascension. As you know, most of you, on October 25th, 1970, she did make her ascension in the light. So Louise Kinninger has at last gone on to her promised reward. I only bring this out because you should understand a little bit about the various phases of human relationships from a religious standpoint before we get too deeply into what is the spiritual teacher. We've got to first understand, and then we can understand where you fit in. Can you be a spiritual teacher? Can any of you become spiritual ministers and minister unto mankind? Why, of course you can. But it is not necessarily the relationship of the disciple and the guru. Do you understand that? You do not necessarily have to be a total guru in order to be a spiritual teacher. A total guru, of course, is something that goes back to the Far Eastern philosophy of the Sikhs and of the Hindu people, and is found largely in the Far Eastern religions, where we find people will take a spiritual teacher to be their guru, and the guru will accept them, and then he not only accepts them for that life supposedly, but for many, many lives to come. And he is supposed to guide them over the rough spots in life and eventually take them safely to a haven of light. Now, of course, this is necessary for some people. For others, they can be satisfied to accept as their guru Jesus the Christ, Master El Morya, the great Master Kuthumi, Mother Mary, or one of the other spiritual teachers who are now ascended. And they therefore do not feel that same compulsion to actually have a physical guru. I think, however, that in some cases, if a person wishes, they may undertake for certain disciples certain actions while they themselves are in embodiment, and certain responsibilities that will give the disciple a little added push into higher dimensions than he could probably go by himself. So we come to deal with the transfer of consciousness. Can the guru transfer his consciousness to his disciple? And my answer would be within limitations, because everything has to go through the doorway of the individual heart. Everything has to occur through the consciousness of the individual. Are we held back? We hold ourselves back. Are we moved forward? We move ourselves forward. Now, what is all important then is the spiritual teaching. And one does not have to be a spiritual guru or spiritual teacher having the total responsibility for the lives of the people that he's talking to or she's talking to. A person can be a spiritual teacher, and a person can accept the teachings almost like a smorgasbord. You can take what is most important or applies to you and use it for the furtherance of your spiritual goal. I will cite an example from the plane of health. When I wake up every morning, I take a scrubbing brush, dry, and I start with the soles of my feet, and I scrub very hard on the soles, then on the foot, then up the legs, to the torso, and on up to the heart, from the hands and arms, through my whole body, my neck, my face, without any problem. Some of you probably might have difficulty. At first, you would probably all have difficulty if you don't do it, because it is very definitely a very sharp and cutting factor, these little brushes. And you can take the skin right off of your body until you toughen it first. So you have to be careful when you start it. But you can take it and use it. Now, I can impart this teaching to you today as an adjunct to good health, which I recommend. You see, you as an individual may know more about health than I do. You could know it's possible for anybody to know a great deal more than the person who's lecturing. But at the same time, you might pick up that one little thing from the smorgasbord of my techniques because I would tell you about it as I have now. And so you would use it in your own life and benefit by it because, first of all, it is a practical God teaching. In this case, in the field of health, but it could be a spiritual technique. So a man does not have to actually, when he is a spiritual teacher, become a guru. He does not have to accept the total responsibility for the lives of those that he is dealing with. But he ought to be at least responsible enough that whatever technique he gives out is a technique of benefit to people if they will use it. The person has to decide whether or not they're going to use it. Now, getting back momentarily to the negatives, because I want to deal with this as a very important reason. A man has a terrible inferiority complex. He feels that he is very inadequate to accomplish anything in the world, and so he begins to almost engage in what is known as the Walter Mitty type of dream. In other words, he sees himself riding on a white horse, or he's sweeping the maiden of his choice off her feet, or he's driving a new Mercedes-Benz down the highway, and everyone's looking at him, or the lady is a prima donna. She's singing for audiences like Risa Stevens, in the Colosseum in Rome or somewhere. And we all have these continual little visions if we allow ourselves to engage in them as a substitution for reality. And I think that daydreaming, while very important, when it's just allowed to run wild so that we actually enjoy the functions of our dreams more than the power of the dream to help us engage ourselves in the business of real living, then you see we defraud ourselves of real living. And our dreams become a substitution, which is like a pacifier for a little baby. We put the pacifier in our mouth and we suck it and we say, oh, we're very happy now, we don't need the milk. But you need the milk. You can't all the time have the pacifier. Because if you have that, that's going to be a substitution, and you're going to go through life and until, as the minister said, he called on the man, he said, that was actually living very close to the church, and he said to him, I'm the new pastor. And he said, oh. And he said, I'd like to invite you to come to church. And so the man said, well, I intend to do it just as soon as I get things straightened out. And he said, all right. He said, well, I hope you come. So 6 months went by, and he went over to see him again. And he said, well, Pastor, I'll tell you, he said, I don't have things quite straightened out yet, but just as soon as they're straightened out, I'll be to church. You can depend on me. And a year later, they buried him from the little church. He finally had everything all straightened out. And so procrastination becomes one of the biggest problems in the world. People are going to procrastinate about applying any kind of a law. And we are the ones that have to apply it for ourselves, and if we will apply it, it will work for us. If we won't apply it, of course, then it won't work for us. But you know something about a gathering such as this? Whenever you get a large number of people together, the reason you feel so strong is because you have all the reinforcements of everybody in the room flowing through your consciousness. You have all of their positive thoughts, and they become a substitute for your own thoughts. Sometimes you have these negative thoughts when you're alone. When you're with a group, by all the positive flow is just zinging right through the room. So you get strong and full of resolves, which you don't carry out, because you do not magnetize from God and from the masters the momentums of the other people. So let me give you a little secret. You have to actually ask God and ask yourself to allow the strengthening power of the gurus of the Spirit, the great masters that are speaking, of the angels, of the archangels. You have to ask that you may receive the energy from the people, not as a vampire, because if it's a vampire energy, if you're just stealing their energy, that's only a temporary gift. You have to ask for what we call the abundant life magnetism. The abundant life magnetism means that it always is radioactive, that it makes more of itself without destroying itself, so that people actually share in this and take nothing away from it, but they actually repolarize their whole energy, and it keeps on and stays with them after the whole conference is over because they have asked for that qualification. Why do you suppose an elderly lady takes her grandchild to bed with her? To vampirize the vital energies out of her body while she's sleeping, of course. She may not even know this. And therefore, those of you who don't want to have this experience should see to it that no one is sleeping in the same bed with you who is actually pulling your vital energy out of your body. This is one of the things that you have to understand. Instead of that, you can, of course, call for the abundant life energy, the abundant, recreative, powerful life of God to surge through you, and then no one can steal anything from you because you will be able to give them the abundant life because you're already experiencing it. You will experience it, and you have ample energy, and it comes from God, and it just keeps on flowing. The problem then, in so many cases, is that people are drawing a little portion of energy from God, and then they feel good, and they go to bed, and they have someone sleeping right near them, and the Rumford coil process is working, where you have the two coils side by side, and the magnetic flux, of course, is going back and forth between them. And then if one is vampirizing the other with their consciousness, you see they're stealing their energy, but the other one is being depleted. Now, under the proper sequence, if you have to be close to someone else, and you people who are married, you should understand that both of you should renew your spiritual energies all the time and call for the abundant life energy, the energy of the abundant life. Jesus said that. He said, "I am come that ye might have life, and that more abundantly." Now, when he said that more abundantly, he referred to the energy of the Christ, the energy of the universal Christ, the energy of the magnetism of God that you can all draw. And this, of course, is the role of the spiritual teacher, to alert people to these things that are true, that will benefit people. So many people are drawn into a room or to some person, and all they're really interested in, that is the person, is attracting people to themselves. One of the reasons why people may often find it is difficult to actually at first stay here in the focus of our radiation, the radiation of the masters. I say ours meaning all of us, and I mean all of the masters, and I mean all of the glory of heaven that we find here. You might probably call it almost the Zohar or the splendor of God, in a sense, because it is here. Now, people who are not oriented to the giving of decrees, for example, in coming here, may find at first that they do not quite understand just what is actually magnetically occurring in the giving of these decrees, and the repetitions of the decrees may seem vain and as though they were not actually producing anything for anyone. In reality, this is because it is your consciousness that is functioning at that level. In reality, it is these decrees that have builded the summit, these decrees that have changed the lives of thousands and thousands of people all over the world. The decrees are powerful. And I'm going to explain to you one of the problems that everyone has at first. That is the problem that most of us in this world come into the world either with our own negative momentums attached, or we allow the barnacles on the ship of some negative force to attach itself to our aura magnetically. And we are coming into this room not as one, but as two or three people. And this is probably what accounts for such situations as the many faces of Eve that you probably recall as a motion picture, which actually bespeaks to us of the many different personalities that are buried within the subconscious of most of us. And these different personalities can be in conflict with one another and thus create internal conflict within ourselves. So when you come into a place such as this, where the magnetism and the polarizations of this center are primarily devoted to the development of the spiritual aspirant, right away the negative entities of the world will start trying to create a feeling of boredom in your consciousness. They will try to say, oh, they're just saying that over and over and over, and that music is going over and over and over, and they keep singing and they keep doing all this, and why don't they ever quit? Well, dear hearts, the reason we don't quit is because we are instructed by the spiritual teachers not to quit. In fact, many years ago, we had a conference in Washington, D.C. At that conference, we had quite a nice crowd. And Moria had set up the program, and we had one session in the morning for about an hour and about a 2-hour session in the afternoon. They were all dismissed. And where did they go in the afternoon? You guessed, to the movies. Most of the people went to the movies in Washington or for strolls along the Potomac. They were not decreeing, they were not praying, they were not taking advantage of the ability to build their momentums. And they allowed themselves to deteriorate into the same old spirals because during the course of that conference, they got together with other people who had negatives in them. And the negative people began to criticize or condemn this or that aspect of either my wife or myself or of the people that were engaged in the program. And right away, their consciousness was successfully put down, as you'll find out in the letters called the Screw Tape Letters, written by C.S. Lewis, who was a fellow of Magdalen College and a very excellent writer on spiritual things. A one-time agnostic, his own experiences convinced him of the validity of the spiritual experience. So all of you should understand that there are negative forces, a la Screw Tape and Wormwood, from the book I'm now speaking, which you will find actually exist to try to take you out of a center of light before you can absorb the essential teachings that are the most productive of true and permanent spirituality in your own lives. You have to learn to guard this condition, to throw off this condition, and to go through the novitiate and experience of finally coming to the place where the decrees become more meaningful to you simply because you put more meaning into them. They are a powerful mantra. Let me recite for your own experience a mantra we learned over in India. Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivaranam Urvarukamiva Bandhanat Mrityor Mokshiya Mamritat. Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivaranam Urvarukamiva Bandhanat Mrityor Mokshiya Mamritat. Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivaranam Urvarukamiva Bandhanat Mrityor Mokshiya Mamritat. Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivaranam Urvarukamiva Bandhanat Mrityor Mokshiya Mamritat. Okay, so you change the vibration with a mantra. Well, our decrees are also mantrams. They are mantrams not spoken in Sanskrit. And basically what you were saying was, we worship Thee, the three-eyed one, O Lord Shiva. We worship Thee, just now requesting of you to please disconnect us from the creeper, even as the cucumber is disconnected from the creeper. So you didn't know what you were saying, you see. But you were asking to be disconnected from the human creeper, and so you could be caught up into the spiritual realms. But somehow or other, people are always glamorized by a turban, and we find that if people will wear turbans and long robes, they can be the worst black magicians in the country, and everyone will flock to them and pay $60 or $70 just to have a reading from them, which is the most ridiculous thing when the Lord has said, Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come to me, and he may receive without money and without price. But there are a few teachings that I want to point out to you that are very, very dangerous. And I must bring it out because one of them is India-oriented and quite prevalent in the United States, which teaching is along the line that our guru is a living master and your guru is a dead master. You have to beware of this teaching always and be extremely careful of it. Because when I told Master Moria about this, he said, so they think we are not living. He said, we are very much alive, and certainly anyone who has an ounce of common sense that's been associated with us any period of time knows that the masters live, and they're certainly not dead. A man doesn't have to live in a physical body in order to be spiritually alive, otherwise what hope would we have? If we lost our bodies, we would lose our souls. Yet these people come out and they condemn the Summit Lighthouse and the Master's teachings and many other organizations and say, oh, well, they don't have a living master. We do. And they cite their master as the most profound proof of all. Well, the difference in our teachings and their teachings is that there is a high degree of tolerance and realization in the Summit Lighthouse. I want to point out to you, as we're discussing this role of the spiritual teacher, a factor that I consider is very important. We have on our staff many people who have been in the field of what is known as hippies. I dare say we have 10 young people on our staff who have been on drugs and involved in all kinds of unwholesome situations, who are now pursuing the path of light and love with their whole hearts and great devotion, because basically they are very idealistic and always were idealistic. It was their idealism which drew them into the associations which they had, which were destructive in their own right, but in time they woke up through their idealism and the help of the masters to follow the profound path that we are on. Now, we have these people on our staff and we're proud of them. We do not condemn anyone because they've taken LSD. We don't condemn the man that still smokes cigarettes, cigars, or pipes. He can still become a member of the activity. We don't condemn a prostitute, some woman that's gone out here and because she's practiced prostitution, which is nothing different than what Mary Magdalene did a long time ago in the time of Jesus, who became one of the chief disciples of Jesus. We do not condemn people because of their involvements in some unholy thing that took place before. We also do not immediately demand that they give up everything that they've ever done, that they have to stop drinking coffee, they have to stop drinking tea, they have to stop all sex activity if they're a married person. We don't demand that. We don't demand that they stop meat eating. We ourselves don't eat meat. Now the point is that we don't have any standard imposed by the organization upon anybody. We will instruct you that we do not believe that tobacco is good for you. We do not believe that LSD is good for you. We know it's not good. We know that coffee and tea are not good. We know excess sex activity, where it becomes a promiscuity, is not good for your health and your spiritual development. We understand all this, but we are patient people, because Master Morya is a patient man. We do not expect that the power and wisdom and teachings that have spanned the centuries is suddenly going to catapult everybody into becoming a saint and turn around and set up some form of fence between those who practice this and those who practice that. We say that all people, as in the time of Jesus, should have the opportunity of coming to the Master's feet. And this is the role of the spiritual teacher, is to bring people to the Master's feet, where they can be cured of their illnesses, where they can be healed of their darkness, where their minds can be impregnated with faith and renewal, where hope can flood their heart, where a new way and a new life can appear to them, and where they can participate in bringing other people. You've heard of what's called halfway house in the world. Well, we're not a halfway house in one way, but in another way you might almost compare us to that. And the day that we stop being that, the day that we here decide that we're going to say that you have to have a rubber stamp on your palm when you come in the door, and on that rubber stamp, that little impression that comes down, it says Saint. That will be the day that we may as well not even exist, because we are here for the express purpose of helping people to become all of that. Master Morya is not approved. I am not approved. Elizabeth is not approved. We understand these human frailties and all of these factions of consciousness and fractions of consciousness. We understand that. But my goodness, people are becoming saints nevertheless in this activity. I must tell you that. They are definitely improving. They are developing power. They are developing understanding. They are developing compassion. They are developing a training course that is going to influence the entire educational system of the entire world. Because the guru here is Master Morya. He is our guru. We have accepted him. Some of our people are devoted to Jesus. Under Morya, they still are devoted to Jesus, and Jesus is their guru. Others have individuals. I don't deny that. And I wouldn't deny anybody the right to love any other person, because I want to make one distinction on this matter of the role of the spiritual teacher that I feel is very important. Here it is. In the beginning, God made man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Now you should understand this statement to imply that every one of you has that stamp already inside of you. But it isn't on your hand, it's on your heart. It's the stamp of the divine image. It's in every one of you. And if you choose to be a spiritual teacher, you can be. But don't be a falsely motivated spiritual teacher. Be one under the direction of the Master. Be willing to take the necessary training to become one. be necessary to study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that need not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth, as St. Paul said. Be a spiritual teacher because you love humanity and because you love God, and you love God enough to make yourself amenable to His will. You know, I told you before, and it is true, that human will is basically behind all human habits. A man elects to pursue a certain course, and he finds it pleasing to his flesh. Maybe it would be smoking cigars, maybe pipes, maybe it would be drinking beer. God only knows what it might be. It is a diversionary activity. So man forms a habit, and it pleases him. And because this habit pleases him, he keeps on doing it. Now he has to have a reason why he should stop. Well, the reason is because it is not a Christly act. Can you imagine Jesus going around puffing on cigars? Can you imagine Mother Mary saying, well, I'll tell you, it'd be really a silly piece of business. Well, don't imagine it for yourself then either. And a lot of things that you do are like, you remember that book that was written many years ago, I think it was by Mr. Shelton. It was called What Would Jesus Do? And it was the story of a town where a movement swept the whole church. And people had a plaque. The minister had it on his desk. It says, what would Jesus do? So every time he made any kind of a decision, he looked at that plaque, and he said, what would he do? And then he made his decision based on what Jesus ought to do. Because he fitted himself into that role of divine sonship. He didn't consider he was not a son of God, and Jesus was. He decided he was a son of God too. And you should decide that. So the movement swept the town. And one millionaire who had this on his desk, he started giving away his money to help people engage in business, and he got more money in the law of return. And my goodness, all kinds of wonderful things happened because of that motto, what would Jesus do? So if you start fitting yourself into this framework, you become an entirely different person. From a person that's ego-oriented to decide what will I do, you decide what would Jesus do? What would God have me do? You begin to be concerned with the will of God. He is not going to take you over unless you want to be taken over and disabuse your mind of that idea. If you think for 1 minute that God or Jesus or the masters are going to suddenly dump on you their consciousness, I tell you no. It will occur because you seek it. It will occur because you demand the spiritual insight from God. You are not satisfied with the husks that are fed to the swine. You want the spiritual power and discernment to be and to know. And you want to know what is and what ain't, as they say. And what ain't is sometimes almost as important as what is. Because if you just get fed the idea of a Pollyanna attitude, where you say, I know how it is to be good. I'm going to be a good person. Well, in your own self-righteousness, you may be that good person. But as soon as you encounter someone who is not that good person, you want to get away from them real quick. And you say to yourself, well, I can't afford to associate with this person because they're not up to my level. I want you to take note that Jesus healed the lepers. I want you to take note that the great masters have always expressed their love to every one of humankind. They have never tried to create some phony or false distinction between people. There is no false distinction where the image of God is concerned because we are all brothers. And the moment we begin to remember that, we can promote profound changes in our life. But the minute that we forget that, then I hear the stories like I heard in New York many years ago. It's an old one. Some of you have heard it before. We were at a Christmas celebration over there. I was speaking before the group. We had an intermission. During the intermission, well, I came down from the podium and I was drinking fruit juice or something, and we were eating cake and everything during the New Year's celebration. And a woman came across the room to me and she said, I want to talk to you. I said, go right ahead. She said, I've got to tell you this. This is very secret. And she leaned over to my ear and she said, you see that woman over there? I said, yes, that's one of the group leaders. She said, well, I want to tell you something about her. I said, well, what is it? She uses mascara. And the worst is yet to come. I opened my eyes and I looked at her and she was covered with it herself. She had all kinds of mascara on, see? So right away I come to realize that Many times life for these people becomes a matter of blaming someone else or excusing someone else, as the French proverb goes. He who points the finger at another points also 3 at himself. And so we have to learn to not find fault with everyone else, but get rid of those negative conditions we have and start looking for the positive and constructive aspects of every human soul, and then we open the doorway for the great power of God to flow through us. It's so easy to misunderstand people. I could cite all kinds of cases of misunderstanding, far more misunderstandings than I could of understanding, so that the understanding becomes unique, whereas the misunderstanding becomes very common. So now coming back to the role of the spiritual teacher. The role of the spiritual teacher is to illumine. And he ought to illumine about God, and he also ought to illumine about the things that keep people from God. And he also ought to illumine about free choice, free will, because this is the divine prerogative. You know, if this world is a mess, would you say that God had failed? I would not, because this world is a globe that is a sphere, that is a schoolroom. It's a schoolroom where imperfect people come to learn to be perfect. And in one way, you can call it a prison house or a charnel house, a place of horror and disgrace in many cases where terrible things happen. The rising rate of crime is reported to us by J. Edgar Hoover, and I have some later reports to read directly from J. Edgar Hoover's office. The rising rate of crime, the depravity of much of the world today is the result of a plan that originated in the powers of darkness' own minds. And these plans are being implemented by other ignorant people on the world scene, who are actually promoting these plans so that they can make money on them. And this is making merchandise of the people of the world. And the people of the world should understand this. I remember when one of the hippies came here, a very nice person, by the way, he said to me, I don't like products. I said, what are you talking about? You know how it is, you sometimes hear certain remarks and you just don't understand them right away, and I was trying to communicate with this man. And when he said, I don't like products, I said, what do you mean by product? He says, hair tonic. Hair tonic and all these things. I said, why don't you like these products? And he said, I don't like them because they're taking the money away from the people, he said, without actually giving them a great deal in return for it. So I began to think this over and mull this over in my mind, and I finally came to understand a little bit what he meant, because actually a bottle of hair tonic that you may pay $2 or $3 for in some cases is probably worth 10 cents. You see what I mean? So he knew what he was talking about. But we'd have to change the economic structure of the world some in order to actually change all of that. So either we have to learn to use Felsnap the soap or else go to the hair tonic. You know what I mean? We have to sort of make our own decision as far as the world's concerned. I learned something from that man, and I think everybody can learn. It made me pause to think, you see, what is really going on in the world today. And I began to realize that, of course, social improvements can be made, and economic improvements can be made. But I decided that I didn't want to be involved to the extent of just devoting my life alone to that, because I have a strange idea, a strange dream. I have a dream that if we go directly to God, if we develop a real consciousness of God in all of the people of the world, that we could solve most all the problems all at once. I mean, the idea is not to hammer a man over the head and do what God doesn't do, and say to people in the economic world, now we're going to picket you. Maybe we should, and I'm going to talk to you about that later on. But at the same time, I don't think it's a matter of just picketing people. I think it's sort of a case of the unjust judge. You remember the parable of the unjust judge? How he was coming out with his judicial robes on. He was coming out of the courthouse, and there was a woman there, a rather elderly lady. She came up and she says, Judge, I want to talk to you. And he went on, got in his vehicle and drove off probably in his Roman chariot in the old days and gathered his robes about himself. He went on his way. And the next morning she was still there. Good heavens, he wondered, had she been there all night waiting?